It was the ninth inning of the most important game of the season when my son-in-law walked in with 4 colleagues. Then he reached behind my television and pulled the plug straight out of the wall. "We have company tonight," he said. "Go to bed, old man." My own daughter was standing right there. She saw everything. She didn't say a single word. She just turned her back and walked straight into the kitchen. That house, I had built it with my own 2 hands, brick by brick, 30 years ago. I didn't argue. The next morning, I made just one phone call. "I'm so grateful you are here. To help us connect, please comment below with your city or country. Also keep in mind, this narrative incorporates fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is coincidental, but the core message remains highly valuable for everyone." The Cleveland Guardians were down by 2 in the bottom of the 9th when my son-in-law walked through my front door and changed everything. I didn't know that yet. I was just sitting in my recliner, the old brown leather one that had molded itself to the shape of my back over 20-some years, holding a glass of iced tea and watching the game with the kind of concentration that only comes when you've been following a team through decades of heartbreak. The Guardians had been my team since before they were even called the Guardians, back when they were the Indians, back when Mary was still alive and would sit on the couch beside me pretending to understand the infield fly rule. I had the volume up a little louder than usual because my hearing isn't what it used to be, and the announcer's voice filled the room with that particular kind of electric tension that only happens in a close 9th inning. I was content. That's the word I'd use. Not happy exactly, because happy had become a complicated thing since Mary passed. But content. Settled. Present in my own home on a Thursday night, the way a man is supposed to be. Then the front door opened. Mark came in first. He always came in first, the way he did everything ahead of everyone else, louder than necessary, filling whatever room he entered, with his particular brand of energy that I had learned over 14 months to brace myself for. He was wearing his work clothes, the business casual kind, a button-down shirt untucked over dark slacks, the kind of outfit that said he wanted people to think he was important, without actually committing to a tie. Behind him came Megan, and behind Megan came 4 people I had never seen before in my life. They were younger, mid-30s maybe. 2 men and 2 women dressed the way young professionals dress when they're trying to seem relaxed, expensive, casual, if that makes any sense. One of the men was already talking loudly into his phone. One of the women was laughing at something on her own screen before she'd even fully stepped inside my house. They carried bags from a chicken wing place on Henderson Road. The smell hit me immediately, that heavy, greasy, sweet, and spicy cloud of takeout that I normally don't mind, but that felt in that particular moment like an invasion. They also had a case of beer, the kind in the tall cans with the craft brewery logo, and someone had a Bluetooth speaker tucked under one arm like it was the most natural thing in the world to bring into someone else's home. Not one of them looked at me. I lowered my glass of iced tea to the side table and watched them move through my living room the way water moves through a space, finding the gaps, filling the corners, rearranging the air. They dropped bags on my coffee table. They pushed my stack of Field and Stream magazines to one side without asking. The man on the phone sat down on the end of my couch, still talking, legs spread wide like he'd been sitting there his whole life. I looked at Mark. He was already moving toward the television, not toward the remote, not toward me, toward the back of the television itself, where the cables ran down behind the entertainment center I'd built from a kit back in 2003. I watched him crouch down, and I watched his hand reach behind the unit, and I watched him pull. The screen went dark. The announcer's voice cut off mid-sentence. The crowd noise, the tension, the bottom of the 9th inning, with 2 men on base gone. Just like that. The room felt suddenly strangely wrong, the way a room feels when the power goes out unexpectedly, that disorienting silence where your brain keeps expecting sound that isn't coming anymore. Mark stood back up and turned to face me. He crossed his arms over his chest. He had the expression of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to go. "We've got company tonight, Arthur." His voice was even almost pleasant, the way a person sounds when they're being deliberately calm about something they know is unreasonable. "Business associates, important ones. We're going to need the living room." I looked at him. I'm 69 years old, and I have been looked down on by better men than Mark Carroll, but something about the way he said it, the way he said, "We're going to need," as if the living room belonged to him, as if my presence in my own recliner was a scheduling conflict he was graciously resolving, made the back of my neck go hot. "The game's in the 9th, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I know." He didn't sound sorry. "But tonight's not great for that. You understand." It wasn't a question. I turned to look at Megan. She was standing in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen, close enough that she'd heard every word, close enough that she could see my face and I could see hers. She was wearing a yellow blouse that I recognized Mary had bought it for her 2 birthdays ago, and something about seeing it on her in that moment made my chest hurt in a way I hadn't expected. She met my eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she turned away and walked into the kitchen and started opening cabinet doors, pulling out plates and glasses for the guests, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had somewhere else to be inside their own head. She didn't say a word. Mark was still looking at me, still waiting, his arms still crossed. One of his colleagues had started unwrapping the chicken wings. The Bluetooth speaker clicked on, and a bass-heavy song began to pulse through the air at a volume that made the framed photographs on my wall seem to vibrate slightly. I put my hands on the armrests of my recliner and pushed myself up. My knees argued about it the way they always do, now that grinding complaint that never quite goes away anymore. I straightened up slowly, and I picked up my glass of iced tea. Mark didn't step aside. He stood there and waited for me to navigate around him, which I did, because what was the alternative? I walked around the coffee table where someone was already spreading out napkins and arranging plastic containers of dipping sauce, and I walked toward the hallway, and I did not look back. But I heard it. The sound of someone dropping onto my couch. The crack of a beer can opening. The rise of voices talking over each other in that way that people talk when they're performing, having a good time. The music getting louder by a notch. I walked down the hall, past the bathroom, past the linen closet, past the framed photo of Megan at her college graduation that had hung on that wall for 16 years. I went into my bedroom and I closed the door behind me, not hard, just closed it. The click of the latch felt very loud in the quiet of the room. I stood there for a moment in the dark before I reached for the light switch. The bedroom looked the same as it always did, the dark wood dresser, the blue curtains Mary had picked out from a catalog in 2011, the bed with its quilted spread that I still slept on my side out of a habit I hadn't been able to break in 2 years. On the dresser in the silver frame I'd bought at a hardware store, and never replaced with anything nicer, was her photograph. Mary, smiling. Taken on a trip to Gatlinburg back when we still took trips when her hair was more silver than brown, and she had that particular look she got when she was genuinely happy, not performing happiness, not being polite but actually fully happy. I set my glass of iced tea down on the nightstand, and I sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking. Not from anger, though. There was anger somewhere underneath everything. They were shaking the way hands shake when something fundamental shifts, when the ground you were standing on turns out to have been less solid than you thought. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed. Through the wall, muffled but audible, came the sound of laughter. Loud, easy, the laughter of people who were comfortable. My house was full of people who were comfortable, and I was sitting alone in my bedroom at 8:30 on a Thursday night. I looked at Mary's photograph for a long time. She had written something to me once in an anniversary card I still had in the nightstand drawer, had kept it all these years, because she had a way with words that I never did a way of saying in one sentence what I'd spend a week trying to figure out. She'd written, "Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." I hadn't thought about that sentence in months. I was thinking about it now. That night wasn't the beginning. I need to be clear about that because when I tell this story, people assume the trouble started the moment Mark unplugged my television. It didn't. The television was just the moment I finally stopped pretending not to see what had been happening for a long time. Let me go back 14 months. It was a Tuesday evening in early May, and I was grilling burgers in the backyard when my phone rang. The weather had been unusually warm for Ohio that time of year, the kind of warm that makes you feel like summer arrived early as a gift before it inevitably turns humid and punishing in July. I had the radio on in the garage, the oldies station out of Columbus, and I was doing what I did most evenings since Mary passed, keeping myself busy enough that the quiet didn't get too heavy. I saw Megan's name on the screen, and I smiled. Back then, calls from her still felt like good news. "Dad." Her voice was tight, in a way I recognized the same way it had sounded when she was 17 and had backed my car into the mailbox. Bracing herself. "Hey, sweetheart. What's going on?" She took a breath. Then she told me. The condo she and Mark had been renting in Hilliard had gone into foreclosure. Not their fault exactly. She said the building's owner had defaulted on the underlying mortgage, and the tenants had received 30 days' notice. They needed somewhere to land, just temporarily. 3 months, maybe 4 at the outside, just until they found a new place and got their feet under them. I didn't let her finish the sentence. "Of course," I said. "This is your home." The relief in her voice was immediate and real, and I felt good about that. I felt genuinely good. The house on Elmwood Drive had been too quiet for 2 years. Some nights I turned on the television just to have voices in the room, not because I wanted to watch anything, but because silence has a weight to it that gets heavier the longer you live alone. The idea of Megan being here, of hearing footsteps in the morning and smelling coffee someone else had made it felt like something coming back to life. The first month was fine. Better than fine, honestly. Megan cooked on Wednesdays. Mark grilled on weekends. There were shoes by the front door and voices in the kitchen, and the house felt inhabited again in a way that did something good for my chest. The second month was mostly fine, too. The third month was when the small things started. Small things are insidious. That's the word for it, insidious, because they don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with an argument or a confrontation. They just appear quietly, one at a time, and each one by itself seems like nothing worth making an issue over. It's only later, when you look back at all of them together, that you see the shape they were making. The first small thing was my recliner. I came home from the hardware store one Saturday afternoon to find it pushed into the corner by the far wall, angled toward the window, in a way that made it look like a piece of furniture that had been stored rather than used. It had sat beside the window facing the television for 15 years. That spot had been its spot since before Megan graduated high school. I asked about it that evening casually, while we were all watching television on the couch, because my chair was now inexplicably in a corner. Megan said the room flowed better this way. Mark nodded in agreement without looking up from his phone. I let it go. The second small thing was my workbench in the garage. I went out one morning to find my tools reorganized, not missing, just moved, sorted into a system that made sense to someone who wasn't me. My socket set was in a drawer where my drill bits used to be. My drill bits were in a cabinet I'd never used for tools. When I spent 20 minutes looking for my channel lock pliers, Megan appeared in the garage doorway and told me cheerfully that she had made the space more functional. I let that go too. The third small thing was Mary's ceramic birds. She had collected them for 20 years. Little porcelain figures, most of them from craft fairs and antique shops, and one memorable afternoon at a flea market in Granville, where she'd found a hand-painted cardinal that she carried home wrapped in her own scarf because she didn't trust the vendor's newspaper. They had lived on the shelf in the living room for as long as I could remember. Not valuable, not to anyone else, but they were hers, and looking at them had always felt like a small proof that she had been here. One afternoon, I came downstairs, and the shelf was bare. I found the birds in the basement, packed carefully into a cardboard box labeled "Decorative Storage" in Megan's handwriting. I stood in the basement, holding the box flaps open, looking at them wrapped in newspaper, the way Mary had wrapped that cardinal in her scarf, and I heard Megan come down the stairs behind me. "Oh, I hope that's okay," she said. Her voice was bright and easy, the voice of someone who had already decided it was okay. They were making the space feel a little cluttered. I thought we could rotate things seasonally. I looked at her. She was smiling genuinely, it seemed, and for a moment I almost said what I was thinking, which was that those birds had been on that shelf for 20 years, and they were going back on that shelf where they belonged. But she looked so certain, so casually, completely certain that this was a reasonable thing she had done that I heard myself say, "Sure, honey, that's fine." I taped the box back closed and went upstairs. That night I sat alone in the garage after Megan and Mark had gone up to bed. The place smelled like motor oil and sawdust, the way it always had. The smell I'd always found more comforting than any candle Mary ever burned. I sat on the old wooden stool I'd had since before Megan was born, and I looked at the wall across from me. Her bicycle hung there. The one she'd had in middle school, red frame, the reflectors still on the wheels. She'd never asked to take it when she moved out at 23, and I'd never taken it down. I thought about the morning I taught her to ride it, running down the sidewalk behind her with my hand on the back of the seat, her screaming at me not to let go, me promising I wouldn't, me letting go anyway, because that's the only way it works. The memory hit me harder than I expected, because somewhere between that morning on the sidewalk and this night in the garage, my daughter had come back to my house and started packing up her mother's things. And I had let it happen one small thing at a time because I loved her, and because conflict takes energy, and because I kept telling myself it wasn't worth the argument. I was still telling myself that. But I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. People ask me why I didn't say something sooner. Why I didn't put my foot down the first time Megan moved my chair, or the second time Mark reorganized my garage, or the third time I found something of Mary's packed into a box that nobody had asked me about. And the honest answer is that I did say something, just not out loud, not in any way that counted. There's a particular kind of silence that a man practices when he loves someone and doesn't want to damage what's left of something good. I had been practicing that silence for 14 months, and sitting in my garage that night, looking at my daughter's childhood bicycle hanging on the wall, I finally started wondering what it had cost me. I bought the house on Elmwood Drive in the spring of 1987. I was 36 years old, Mary was 34, and we had a son named Jimmy, who was 6, and a daughter named Megan, who was 2.5, and couldn't say the word porch correctly, and called it a pork instead, which made Mary laugh every single time without fail. The house needed work. That was the polite way to put it. The previous owners had let things go, and the inspection report read like a list of every structural problem a house in central Ohio can develop over 40 years of neglect. The roof needed replacing. The basement leaked when it rained. The kitchen was a monument to 1970s design choices that nobody had seen fit to correct. Mary stood in that kitchen on the day we closed and looked at the avocado green appliances and said with complete sincerity, "We can fix this." That was Mary. She saw potential where other people saw problems. We fixed it. Not all at once, we didn't have that kind of money, but piece by piece, year by year, the way you build something real. I replaced the roof myself one summer with help from Frank DeLuca, my oldest friend. a big, stubborn Italian man from Westerville who had known me since we worked together at the same manufacturing plant in 1981, and who showed up that Saturday with a nail gun and a cooler full of Pepsi and absolutely no patience for my tendency to second-guess measurements. Frank was the kind of man who fixed things first and complained about his back afterward, and I had needed exactly that kind of friend more times than I could count. We built the deck together too, Frank and I, in the summer of 1994. Pressure-treated lumber 4x4 posts a railing that I was proud of in the way a man is proud of something he made with his own hands. Jimmy was 13 that summer and considered himself too old to help, but not too old to wander out periodically and offer opinions. Megan was 9 and brought us lemonade with too much sugar and sat on the grass watching us work with the focused attention she gave everything back then. Mary planted the garden along the south fence that same year. Hosta's black-eyed Susan's a climbing rose that took 3 years to really take off, and then grew so aggressively she had to negotiate with it every spring. She loved that garden the way I loved the deck, as a thing she had made from nothing that proved something about what she was capable of. I paid off the mortgage in 2019. 32 years of payments, and then one Tuesday afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote the final check and felt something I hadn't expected, which was not triumph, but a quiet, satisfied certainty. This was ours. Completely, fully, legally ours, in a way that no bank could ever dispute again. Mary died 8 months later. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and vicious, the kind that doesn't negotiate. She was diagnosed in March and she was gone by August. And in between those 2 months was a stretch of time that I don't know how to describe except to say that it was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I would do it again without hesitation, because being with her was always better than not being with her even at the end. After the funeral, after the paperwork, after the weeks of casseroles from neighbors and phone calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, my attorney, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had handled our estate planning since 2009, sat across from me in her office downtown and walked me through what came next. Mary's half of the house passed to me automatically under the terms of the living trust we'd set up years before. Patricia explained the options for what to do from there. I could leave everything in the trust as is. I could add beneficiaries. I could restructure. I was 67 years old, and I had just buried my wife, and I was not thinking clearly. What I was thinking was that Jimmy was in Denver with a good job and his own life and some financial complications of his own that I didn't fully understand, and that Megan was here nearby, the one who had driven Mary to appointments when I couldn't, the one who had sat in that hospital room for hours. I wanted to do something that felt like trust, so I signed paperwork that added Megan as a co-beneficiary with certain property rights, what Patricia had explained as a tenants in common arrangement on the residential title separate from the trust structure. It meant Megan held a recognized interest in the property. It was not the same as full ownership, but I didn't fully understand the difference at the time, and I didn't ask enough questions, and Patricia, to her credit, explained it carefully. I just wasn't in a condition to absorb it. I thought I was being generous. I thought I was telling my daughter, I trust you. This is yours too. I did not think I was handing someone a document that could be used against me. Frank had called me an hour after I got home from signing those papers. He had a way of doing that calling at the exact wrong moment, or maybe the exact right one, depending on how you look at it. "You doing okay, Art?" he asked. "I just got back from Patricia's," I said. A pause, and I added Megan to the house. Another pause longer. "You sure about that?" "She's my daughter, Frank." He didn't say anything else about it, but I remembered later that he had paused. Frank DeLuca did not pause over things that didn't worry him. I sat in the garage that night on my old wooden stool, and I thought about that pause. 2 years later, it had started to mean something different than it had at the time. My phone buzzed on the workbench beside me. I picked it up. Frank. Calling now as if he'd known I was thinking about him, which with Frank was not entirely impossible. Then I sat on my stool for a moment longer in the dark, and the motor oil smell of my garage, and I thought about Dorothy Miller. Dot. She had lived in the gray Colonial across the street from us since 1999, back when her husband Richard was still alive, and their kids were still in school, and the neighborhood block parties ran until 10 o'clock on summer Saturdays. Mary had loved her immediately, the way Mary loved certain people decisively, without reservation, as if she had known them in some previous arrangement and was simply patronizing them again. They had spent 20 years drinking coffee at each other's kitchen tables, trading plant cuttings from their gardens, and saying things to each other that they would never say to anyone else. She never made a production of it. She'd hand me the container, say something practical like, "There's enough for 2 nights," or, "It needs 20 minutes at 3:50, and leave before I could thank her properly. That was Dot. Efficient with kindness in a way that never made you feel pitied. I went inside and called Frank back. "What did she say?" I asked. "She wants to talk to you herself. Tomorrow morning," she said, "before your daughter and her husband leave for work." I was out front at 7:15 the next morning checking the mailbox for something that didn't need checking when Dot appeared on her porch in a yellow cardigan with a coffee mug in both hands, watching me the way she watched everything steadily, without pretense. She crossed the street. "Walk with me to the end of the block," she said. Not a question. We walked. The morning was already warm, the kind of July morning that promises an unpleasant afternoon. Dot didn't speak until we'd turned the corner onto Ashford Lane out of sight of my front windows. "I was watering my tomatoes Thursday evening," she said. "The ones along the fence near the side yard. Your daughter was on the back patio on her phone. She didn't see me." I kept walking. "What did you hear?" Dot wrapped both hands tighter around her mug. "She was talking to someone about you, about your health." She paused. "She said you'd been forgetting things, that you left the stove on twice last week, that you'd gotten confused about what day it was and missed a doctor's appointment." I stopped walking. "No," I said. "None of it." She nodded once firmly, as if confirming something she'd already known. "I didn't think so. You remembered my granddaughter's birthday last month when I forgot it myself." We stood on the corner of Ashford Lane in the morning heat, and I felt something cold move through me despite the temperature. Not panic. Something more like the feeling of stepping onto ice and hearing it shift beneath your weight, that fraction of a second where you understand exactly what is happening before your body catches up. "Did you hear who she was talking to?" I asked. "No, but she was using her careful voice." Dot said it matter-of-factly. The voice people use when they're talking to someone official, or someone they want to impress. I thanked her. She squeezed my arm once hard the way Mary used to when she wanted to make sure I was actually listening, and then she crossed back to her side of the street without another word. Frank showed up at my garage that evening, with 2 cans of Pepsi, and the expression he wore when he was angry on someone else's behalf, which was the same expression he wore when he was angry on his own behalf, just slightly more controlled. "Talk," he said, settling onto the spare stool like he owned it, which in some ways he did. He'd helped me build the workbench it was sitting next to, so I talked. I told him about the birds, about the chair, about the tools, about the phone call Dot had overheard. Frank listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without nodding encouragingly, just taking it in with his arms crossed and his jaw set. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, walked to the corner of the garage where my recliner had ended up before Megan moved it inside, and he pointed at the empty space near the window where it used to sit. "That chair's been by that window for 20 years, he said. "Right there. You moved it in when we had that cold snap in February of '04 because the draft from the window was bothering your back. You remember that?" I remember. And now it's in a corner. He turned to look at me. When did you stop being the kind of man who says something when someone moves his chair? The question landed harder than I expected. Not because it was unfair, because it was exactly fair, and I didn't have a good answer for it. I turned the Pepsi can in my hands. The aluminum was cold and starting to sweat in the July heat. She's my daughter, I said finally. I know she is. Frank sat back down. His voice dropped a register the way it did when he was being serious rather than blunt. But Art, something is happening in that house. You know it. I know it. I looked at the workbench, at the tools in their wrong places, at the empty hook where Mary's garden gloves used to hang before someone had decided the garage needed to be more functional. Dot said Megan was using her careful voice, I said, with whoever she was talking to. Frank looked at me steadily. Yeah, he said. That's the part I keep coming back to, too. We sat with that for a minute, the two of us in the garage that smelled like every project we'd ever worked on together. Then Frank said something that I hadn't let myself think yet. Art, when's the last time you actually looked at the paperwork you signed after Mary died? The house stuff. The title. I didn't answer right away. The Pepsi can in my hand had gone warm without my noticing. That was the moment I understood, sitting across from my oldest friend in the garage we had built together, that I had been so busy letting things go that I had never stopped to look at exactly what I had let go of. I found it on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't looking for it. That's usually how the truth works. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. Frank's question had been sitting with me for 2 days. When's the last time you actually looked at the paperwork I'd told myself I would get to it the way you tell yourself you'll get to the thing in the back of the refrigerator that you know needs to be thrown out? You keep opening the door and seeing it, and closing the door again. Eventually, you can't keep doing that. So that Tuesday morning, after Megan and Mark had left for work, and the house had settled into its particular daytime quiet, I went into my home office and started going through the filing cabinet in the corner. It was a 2-drawer steel cabinet I'd had since the 90s, the kind with the key that I'd lost sometime around 2015 and never replaced because I never needed to lock it. My own house, my own files. The top drawer held tax records, insurance documents, the deed to the house, the trust paperwork Patricia had prepared, vehicle titles, and a collection of owner's manuals for appliances I no longer owned. Normal stuff. The kind of accumulated paper that a life generates. I went through it methodically. The deed looked the way I remembered it. The trust documents were where they should be. I pulled them out and sat at my desk and read through the relevant sections more carefully than I had when I'd signed them, which wasn't saying much because I'd been in no condition to read carefully 2 years ago. I was halfway through the second drawer when I found the envelope. It was tucked behind a folder of old utility bills, which was not where I put it, and not a place I would have put anything important. The envelope was from the Ohio Secretary of State's office. It was addressed to Carroll Property Solutions, LLC, care of 4412 Elmwood Drive, Upper Arlington, Ohio. My address. I held it in my hands for a moment. The envelope had already been opened. Someone had slit it neatly along the top with a letter opener, or a knife removed the contents, and then slid the envelope back behind the utility bills. I pulled out the document inside. It was a certificate of organization, filed 8 months ago in November for a limited liability company called Carroll Property Solutions, LLC. The registered agent, the person legally designated to receive official correspondence on behalf of the company, was listed as Mark D. Carroll. The registered agent address was listed as 4412 Elmwood Drive, Upper Arlington, Ohio. In Ohio, a registered agent address has to be a physical location where documents can be received during business hours. It doesn't have to be the agent's own property. But using someone else's address without their knowledge or consent is not something you do by accident. You type an address into a form. You make a deliberate choice. I set the document on my desk. I looked at it for a long time. Then I typed Carroll Property Solutions, LLC into the search bar on my computer. The website came up immediately. Clean design, professional looking. The kind of site that costs a few $100s and a weekend to put together if you know what you're doing. The header said Carroll Property Solutions, Central Ohio Real Estate Investment. There was a phone number. There was a contact form. There was a brief paragraph about the company's mission to identify undervalued residential properties in the Columbus metro area. The contact address listed at the bottom of the page was 4412 Elmwood Drive, Upper Arlington, Ohio. My house was the headquarters of Mark Carroll's real estate investment company. Had been for 8 months. Without my knowledge. Without my permission. Without anyone mentioning it to me at the dinner table or in the kitchen, or at any point during any conversation we had ever had. I picked up my phone and called Frank. He picked up on the second ring. I read him what was on the certificate. There was a silence on his end that was not the comfortable kind. "Art," he said finally, "you need to call Patricia." "I know. Now, not after lunch. Now." I had Patricia Okafor's number memorized, which tells you something about how often I'd needed it over the past 2 years. She answered on the third ring, and I could hear the particular quality of attention in her voice shift the moment I told her what I was holding. Patricia was 58 years old and had been practicing estate and trust law in Columbus for nearly 30 years. She had a way of asking questions that made you understand she had already formed a hypothesis and was simply confirming it, precise, efficient, with no wasted motion. "Read me the filing date," she said. I read it. "And the registered agent address is definitely your residential address, your home address." "Yes." "Did you authorize that in writing at any point, sign anything related to a business entity at that address?" "No." A brief pause. When she spoke again, her voice was measured and deliberate. "Arthur, I want you to photograph every page of that document with your phone and send it to me immediately. Then I want you to put the original back exactly where you found it. Don't mention this to Mark or Megan tonight. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good." Another pause. "Is there anything else in that filing cabinet that looks like it doesn't belong there?" I looked at the open drawer, at the folders I hadn't gone through yet. "I don't know yet," I said. "Keep looking," Patricia said. "And Arthur, lock your office door when you're done." I took the photographs and sent them. Then I kept looking through the drawer. I didn't find anything else that morning. But the thing about looking carefully at something you thought you knew is that it changes the way you see everything around it. I was still at my desk when my phone buzzed. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. It read, "Mr. Vance, this is Sandra Cole from Realty One Group Columbus. I was hoping to speak with you about the property at 4412 Elmwood Drive. Please call me at your earliest convenience regarding the listing." I read it twice. The listing. I had not listed my house. I had not spoken to anyone at Realty One Group Columbus. I had not had any conversation with any real estate agent about any property at any point in the past 2 years. But someone had given Sandra Cole my phone number, and someone had told her there was a listing to discuss. A real estate agent doesn't contact a homeowner out of nowhere. Somebody gave her my number. Somebody told her the property might be available, and that somebody had done it without mentioning it to me, which meant either they had forgotten I existed or they had decided I didn't matter enough to consult. I sat at my desk for 3 full minutes before I called Sandra Cole back. I needed those 3 minutes. Not because I was going to fall apart, I wasn't, but because I have learned over 69 years that the most important conversations are the ones you enter with your voice fully under control. Mary used to say that anger is loudest right before it goes quiet, and that the quiet version is the one people actually listen to. She was right about most things. Sandra Cole answered on the first ring. Her voice was professional and bright. The voice of someone who spent her days making strangers feel comfortable about the largest financial decisions of their lives. Mr. Vance, thank you so much for returning my call. I'm reaching out because we had an inquiry about the Elmwood Drive property, and I wanted to touch base with you directly about timing. What kind of inquiry? I asked. A brief pause. The kind that happens when someone realizes the conversation isn't going the way they prepared for. Well, we were contacted a few weeks ago by a representative of the property. He indicated you were considering downsizing in the near future and wanted to get a sense of current market value before making any decisions. A representative, I said. That's right, a Mr. Carroll. He said he was acting on your behalf. I wrote the name down on the notepad on my desk, even though I didn't need to. It steadied my hand to do it. And what did Mr. Carroll tell you about the property? He gave us a general description, 4-bedroom, 2.5 bath, the lot size, the age of the house. He mentioned some updates you'd made over the years. The deck, the kitchen remodel. Another small pause. He seemed very familiar with the property. I'm sure he did, I said. Ms. Cole, I want to be direct with you. I did not authorize anyone to contact your agency on my behalf. I am not considering selling this property. I have not discussed selling this property with anyone. If Mr. Carroll represented himself as acting on my behalf, that representation was not accurate. The silence on her end lasted a beat longer than the previous ones. Oh. Her voice had lost some of its brightness. I'm very sorry, Mr. Vance. I had no idea. He seemed completely... I understand, I said. You did nothing wrong. I just wanted to make sure we were clear. After I hung up, I sat very still. Mark had called a real estate agent, given her a description of my house, told her I was planning to downsize, used the word behalf. All of this without my knowledge, without my consent, without any conversation between us that could be even generously interpreted as permission. I photographed my notepad with Sandra's number and the notes I'd written and sent it to Patricia. Her response came back in 4 minutes. Good. Don't delete this. I'll call you this afternoon. The afternoon came and went. Patricia called at 3:15 and we spoke for 20 minutes. She asked careful questions and took careful notes and told me she was beginning to put together a fuller picture. She said the word pattern twice, which was not a word she used casually. I cooked dinner that evening. Pasta, the simple kind, the kind I'd been making since the kids were small, olive oil, garlic, canned tomatoes, a handful of whatever herbs were still alive in the pot on the kitchen windowsill. When Megan and Mark came home at 6, the kitchen smelled like something that had been a home once, and I set 3 places at the table the way I always did. Mark sat across from me and ate with the easy appetite of a man who was not worried about anything. He asked me how my day was. I told him quiet. He nodded and reached for more bread. Megan talked about a problem at her office, something about a vendor contract that had gone sideways, and I listened and asked a question or two and passed the salad. The conversation moved the way dinner conversation moves when people are performing normalcy, covering the surface, not touching what's underneath. I was clearing the plates when Mark's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, then turned it face down in the particular way people turn phones face down when they don't want the screen seen. I noticed. I didn't react. Megan started the dishwasher. Mark said he was going to make some calls and disappeared into the living room, pulling the door most of the way closed behind him. I finished wiping down the counter and hung the dish towel on the oven handle the way I had for 30 years. Then I heard his voice from the other side of the door. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even speaking loudly. But the house was quiet, and the door wasn't fully closed, and some combinations of circumstances just carry. Told you it takes time. The old man doesn't suspect anything. A pause while the other person spoke. I know, but we can't push it. We just need a little more time, and then we can move forward the way we planned. I stood at the kitchen counter with the dish towel in my hand. The old man doesn't suspect anything. I set the towel down very carefully on the counter. I turned off the kitchen light. Then I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, the same hallway I had walked 14 months ago when I first let them move in, and I closed the door behind me. My hands were not shaking this time. That was the difference. 2 days ago in my bedroom after the television, my hands had shaken from the shock of something I hadn't seen coming. Tonight, they were steady. Because tonight, I understood something I hadn't before. This was not a situation that had gotten out of hand. This was a situation that had been planned. There was a difference between a person who takes too much and a person who intends to take everything. I was only now beginning to understand which one I was dealing with. I picked up my phone and texted Patricia 3 words, "Call me tomorrow." Then I looked at Mary's photograph on the dresser and thought about what she would have said. She would have said something practical, probably. Something that sounded simple and turned out to be true. She had that gift. I thought she would have said, "Now you know," and now I did. I always thought the hardest thing about getting older was the body. The way your knees start filing formal complaints every morning. The way your back holds grudges for days after you do something it considers unreasonable, like lifting a bag of mulch or sleeping in a position that would have been perfectly comfortable at 40. I had made my peace with most of that. You learn to negotiate. What I was not prepared for was sitting in a doctor's office on a Thursday morning and realizing that someone had been there before me. Dr. Hassan had been my physician for 11 years. He was a careful, methodical man in his early 50s who had the particular quality of stillness that good doctors develop the ability to listen without fidgeting, to look at you without making you feel examined. I had always appreciated that about him. Our appointments ran like clockwork. He checked the things that needed checking. We talked about my blood pressure and my vitamin D levels and whether I was sleeping enough, and then I went home. Reliable. Predictable. That Thursday morning, nothing was predictable. He came into the examination room with his tablet and sat across from me, and the first thing I noticed was that he didn't quite meet my eyes the way he usually did. He looked at his screen, then at me, then back at his screen. "How have you been feeling, Arthur, overall?" "Fine," I said. "Same as last time." He nodded slowly, made a note. "Any trouble sleeping?" "No more than usual." Another note. "And how's your memory been? Any moments of confusion? Difficulty keeping track of appointments or daily tasks?" I felt something shift in my chest. Not dramatically. Just a small, quiet shift, like a door closing somewhere in a house you thought you knew. "No," I said. "Why?" He set the tablet on his knee. He looked at me directly for the first time since he'd come in, and I could see the discomfort in his face, the expression of a professional man caught between his obligation to a patient and a conversation he'd already had with someone else. "Arthur, I received a call last week. From your daughter." The room got very still. "She expressed some concerns," he continued carefully. "She mentioned you'd left the stove on twice in the past month, that you'd missed an appointment, and seemed confused about the date. She asked if I would document any relevant observations during today's visit." I looked at him for a long moment. The fluorescent light above us hummed at a frequency I had never noticed before. "Dr. Hassan," I said, "did I miss an appointment?" He checked his screen. "No. In 11 years, have I ever missed an appointment?" A pause. "No." "Have you observed any evidence of cognitive decline in me at any point during our relationship as patient and physician?" He was quiet for a moment. That told me everything. "No," he said. "I have not." "Then I need you to understand something." I kept my voice even, the way I'd kept it even with Sandra Cole, the way I was learning to keep it even in situations that wanted to make me anything but. My daughter called your office and asked you to document observations that don't exist. I don't know exactly why yet, but I need you to know that the information she gave you was not accurate. Dr. Hassan set his tablet on the counter beside him. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked like a man recalibrating. I appreciate you telling me that, he said quietly. I need something from you, I said. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to be accurate. If someone asks you officially in writing through any kind of legal process what you have observed about my cognitive function over the past 11 years, I need that answer to reflect what you actually know. He nodded. It will. Thank you. I drove home in a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. In Ohio, a guardianship petition, the legal process by which one person seeks court authority to make decisions for another, requires medical documentation. It requires a physician or licensed professional to submit evidence to the Franklin County Probate Court, confirming that the proposed ward lacks the capacity to manage their own affairs. Without that documentation, the petition has no foundation. Megan had called Dr. Hassan because she needed him to provide that foundation. He had not provided it, but she had tried. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes. The house looked exactly as it always had, brick front white trim, the Japanese maple I'd planted in 2002 spreading its red leaves over the front walk. Nothing about it looked different. Everything about it felt different. I went inside through the side door, the one that opens into the laundry room. I hung my keys on the hook. I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink, drinking it, and looking out at the backyard, at the garden where Mary's climbing rose was in its 3rd week of bloom. That was when I heard Megan. She was upstairs in the bedroom she and Mark were using, and she was on the phone. The air conditioning had cycled off a few minutes earlier, and the house was quiet enough that her voice carried down the stairwell with more clarity than she probably realized. The doctor's office said they'd document it. A pause. I know it takes time, but we need something in writing before we can file. Another pause longer. I understand. I just want to make sure we have everything ready before we move forward with the petition. I stood at the kitchen sink with my glass of water, and I did not move. The petition. The guardianship petition. The legal document that, if approved by a probate court judge, would transfer the right to make decisions about my life, my finances, my property, my medical care, where I lived, to someone else. To Megan. My daughter was standing 20 feet above my head, in a bedroom in my house, making arrangements to have a court declare me incompetent. I set the glass down on the counter. My hand pressed flat against the cool tile of the kitchen counter, and I stood there and breathed. In, out. The rose in the backyard moved slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel from inside. I thought about Mary's cardinal, the one she'd wrapped in her scarf to carry home from that flea market. The one that was in a box in the basement right now because the living room had felt cluttered. I picked up my phone, called Patricia. She answered on the 2nd ring. Pat, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was something at least. How fast can you move? A beat of silence. Then her voice careful and precise. Arthur, what just happened? Everything, I said. I need you to move fast. Patricia had told me to sit tight and let her work. So that evening, I did the only thing that made sense to me, which was the thing I had done every Thursday evening for 30 years. I made iced tea. The real kind, the kind Mary had taught me, loose leaf steeped long enough to be strong, poured over ice with a slice of lemon and a single teaspoon of sugar, not 2, because Mary had always said 2 was how you ruined a perfectly good glass of tea. I carried it to my recliner. I turned on the television. I found the Guardians game, 30 years of Thursdays. That was what it added up to. Mary and I had started the tradition accidentally, the way the best traditions start, not by deciding to do something, but by doing it twice and then finding you couldn't stop. The first time was a Thursday in 1994, the same summer. Frank and I built the deck when I'd come in from working outside and collapsed into the couch and found a game on, and Mary had brought me a beer without being asked and sat down beside me. She didn't know anything about baseball. She knew I loved it, which she had always treated as sufficient reason to be interested. She asked questions the whole first game. Reasonable questions, patient questions, questions that made me realize I had been watching baseball for 30 years without ever having to explain it to anyone before. What's the infield fly rule? Why does the manager come out to the mound if he's not going to pitch? Why do they spit so much? I answered every one, and somewhere around the 7th inning she stopped asking questions and started watching. And by the 9th, she was leaning forward in a way that told me she actually cared who won. She fell asleep before the final out. She almost always fell asleep before the final out. That became the joke between us. Her official position was that she was deeply interested in baseball, but her body simply couldn't sustain consciousness past the 7th inning. My position was that she was the world's most dedicated fair-weather fan, devoted in spirit, unreliable in practice. We had that argument maybe 400 times over 30 years, and we both enjoyed every one. After she died, Thursdays became the hardest night of the week. Not because of the baseball, because of the specific weight of sitting in a chair that remembered her sitting beside me in a room that still had her reading glasses on the side table for 3 months, because I couldn't bring myself to put them away. I had kept the tradition anyway. It felt like something I owed her, the acknowledgement that Thursday evening still meant something, even when she wasn't there to fall asleep before the 7th inning. So that particular Thursday, knowing what I knew, having heard what I'd heard from behind a closed kitchen door, and from a doctor who'd been put in an impossible position, and from a real estate agent who'd thought she was doing normal business, I sat in my recliner, and I watched the Guardians, and I drank my iced tea, and I let myself for just a little while be the man who had built this house and loved this woman, and raised these children, and paid off this mortgage, and earned the right to sit in this chair on a Thursday evening without anybody's permission. Then the front door opened. I have already told you what happened next. Mark and his colleagues, the food and the beer, and the Bluetooth speaker. The way none of them looked at me. The way Mark walked behind the television without hesitation, without apology, without a single moment of consideration for the man sitting in the chair who had owned this house since before Mark Carroll was old enough to drive. But I haven't told you about the moment before my hand went numb. Megan was standing in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen. She was wearing that yellow blouse, the one Mary had picked out at a boutique on Lane Avenue 2 birthdays ago, taken 3 stores to find it in the right size, wrapped it herself in tissue paper, because Megan loved things wrapped properly. Mary had been so pleased when Megan opened it. She'd touched the fabric with 2 fingers lightly and said it was exactly right, and Megan had worn it tonight. On this particular night. And when she looked at me and saw what was happening, she turned away. That was the moment. Not the television going dark. Not Mark's voice telling me to go to bed in my own house. The moment was my daughter in her mother's gift, looking at her father's face and choosing to look away. I walked down the hallway. I closed my bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at Mary's photograph, and I thought about everything that had accumulated over 14 months. The chair in the corner, the birds in the basement, the doctor's appointment, the guardianship petition, the real estate agent, the LLC, the phone call through the door, the old man doesn't suspect anything. And then I thought about the card in the nightstand drawer. I pulled it out. Our 35th anniversary. Mary's handwriting, the looping, careful cursive she'd had since grade school. She'd written 3 paragraphs, and then at the bottom, as if it were an afterthought, but wasn't she had written, "Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." I read it 4 times. Then I set it down on the nightstand, and I picked up my phone, and I typed into the search bar, Buckeye State Movers, Columbus, Ohio. The website came up immediately. Hours of operation, service area, a phone number, a button that said, "Schedule your move." I looked at it for a long time. Through the wall came the sound of music and laughter, and the easy noise of people who felt completely at home. In my house. On a Thursday night. While I sat alone in my bedroom with my wife's anniversary card on the nightstand, and 30 years of Thursdays pressing down on my chest like something I had been carrying for a long time, without knowing it had a name, I pressed the button. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry, though there was anger somewhere in the mix. I didn't sleep because for the first time in 14 months, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and knowing that made the ordinary machinery of sleep feel beside the point. I lay in the dark and I listened to the house, the air conditioning cycling on and off, the refrigerator running its quiet hum from the kitchen. Somewhere upstairs, the sound of Mark moving around getting a glass of water at 2 in the morning, with the comfortable freedom of a man who had no idea that anything was about to change. I let him have that. It was the last night he'd have it. At 5:30, I got up, put on my clothes, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The sky outside the window above the sink was the particular blue-gray of an Ohio summer morning, before the sun has fully committed to rising that tentative hour when the birds start and everything else is still deciding. I stood at the counter and watched it get lighter, and I drank my coffee, and I did not turn on the television. I thought about the deck. I could see it through the back window, the pressure-treated boards I'd laid down with Frank in the summer of 1994, weathered now to a soft gray, the railing I'd been proud of for 30 years. In the summer, Mary had put her container garden out there. Tomatoes, basil, a pot of marigolds, she said, kept the bugs away. I had pretended to be skeptical about the marigolds. I had not been skeptical. I had just liked the way she explained things to me as if I needed educating, and I had liked being educated by her, and I had never told her that. I should have told her more things. That was one of the truths, that retirement gives you the time to add up all the things you should have said while you were busy with other things. At 8:15, I called Buckeye State Movers and confirmed the appointment for the following morning. The woman on the phone was efficient and kind, in the way that people in service jobs sometimes are genuinely without performance. She asked me if I needed packing materials. I told her most things were already in boxes. She didn't ask why. Then I called Patricia. She answered before the second ring, which told me she had been expecting my call. That was Patricia. She anticipated things, positioned herself in advance, never seemed surprised by information that should have surprised her. "I need to come in today," I said. "I have a 10 o'clock opening," she said. "Can you be here by 9:45? Yes. Her office was on the 14th floor of the Huntington Center building in downtown Columbus. I had been there more times than I could count over the past 2 years, and I had never once looked out the window. That morning I did. The city spread out below in the particular orderly way of Midwestern cities, the grid of streets, the Scioto River catching the morning light, the Ohio State House dome visible to the south. It looked like what it was. A place people had built and lived in and were still living in. Patricia sat across from me with a folder already open. She had been busy since my call the night before, which did not surprise me. "I want to walk you through the trust structure," she said, "because I think you need to understand exactly what you have here before tomorrow." She explained it the way she explained everything, precisely in plain language, without condescension. The Revocable Living Trust that she and I had set up in 2009 held title to the house at 4412 Elmwood Drive. That meant the property was legally owned not by Arthur Vance, the individual, but by the Arthur and Mary Vance Family Trust. When I had added Megan to the property title after Mary died, What had actually been transferred was a beneficiary interest, a recognized stake in the trust's assets, not a deed of ownership in the conventional sense. The distinction matters enormously, Patricia said. Mark has been operating under the assumption that Megan's interest in the property gives him leverage. It doesn't. Not the kind he thinks it does. The trust controls the property. You control the trust. I looked at the folder in front of her, and the documents Megan signed when she applied for the mortgage. Patricia's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. That's what I want to talk to you about next. I've been looking into the lien filed against the property, and what I found isn't simple. She paused. Arthur Mark took out a loan, a significant one. He used Megan's beneficiary interest as collateral with a hard money lender, a private lending company that issues short-term high-interest loans typically used in real estate investment. The kind of lender that moves fast and asks fewer questions than a bank. How much? I asked. $180,000. She let that sit for a moment. Megan signed the paperwork. Whether she fully understood what she was signing is a question I can't answer yet. But her signature is on it. I sat with that number. $180,000 borrowed against my house, against my family's trust, by a man who had moved into my home under the pretense of needing temporary shelter, who had told a real estate agent he was acting on my behalf, who had stood in my living room and told me to go to bed. What's the interest rate? I asked, because I had spent enough years in the working world to know that the interest rate on that kind of loan told you everything about the desperation behind it. 14%, Patricia said. Annualized. I nodded slowly. What do I need to sign today? We spent 40 minutes on paperwork. Updates to the trust documentation of my intent, a formal letter from Patricia to the hard money lender, putting them on notice regarding the trust structure and the validity of the lien. She was thorough in the way that good attorneys are thorough, not because they expect to use everything, but because they want to have everything in case they need it. When I left her office at 11:30, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes before starting the engine. The air in the garage was cool and smelled of exhaust and concrete, the unsentimental smell of practical things. I called Frank. Can I stay at your place for a few days? I asked. I'll make up the guest room, he said. Not a single follow-up question. 35 years of friendship, and the man still knew exactly when not to talk. I started the car and drove back to Elmwood Drive. Megan and Mark were still at work. The house was quiet. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching things: the doorframe of my home office, the kitchen counter, where Mary had rolled out pie crusts on Thanksgiving mornings, the window in the living room that the afternoon light came through at an angle that made the hardwood floors glow amber in October. I was ready. The following morning at 9:28, a white truck with Buckeye State Movers painted on the side in blue letters pulled up in front of the house. A man climbed down from the passenger side. Broad shoulders, firm handshake, the kind of unhurried competence that comes from doing physical work well for a long time. Mr. Vance, he said. I'm Mike. We spoke yesterday. I looked at the truck, then at the house, then back at Mike. You ready to get started? He asked. More than ready, I said. Mike asked me what we were moving today. I thought about it for a second, genuinely thought about it, standing on the front porch of the house I had owned since 1987, in the particular morning light that came through the oak tree at the corner of the yard and made the lawn look greener than it actually was. My life, I said. He laughed. It was an easy, unguarded laugh, the kind that comes before a person realizes the other person wasn't joking. Then he looked at my face and the laugh settled into something quieter. Well, he said carefully, let's make sure we take good care of it. I appreciated that more than he knew. There were 3 of them. Mike ran the operation with the calm authority of someone who had moved hundreds of households and understood that what looked like furniture to an outside eye was never actually furniture to the person who owned it. Danny was the youngest, maybe 23, with the energy of someone who had not yet learned that his back would eventually start keeping score. Carl was older, closer to my age, a man of very few words who communicated primarily through the efficiency of his movements and an occasional nod that managed to convey complete sentences. They started with the easy things. My home office, first the filing cabinet, the desk, the bookshelves. I had built into the alcove in 2006 when I ran out of surfaces to put books on. Box after box came out of that room. Tax records going back 20 years, the kind of paper accumulation that happens when you own property and pay bills and exist in a country that requires documentation of your existence. I carried what I could. My back lodged its usual complaints, but I ignored them the way I had learned to ignore the complaints of things that were going to keep complaining regardless. At one point, I came out of the office carrying a box that was heavier than I had estimated, and Mike appeared beside me without a word and lifted it out of my hands with the matter-of-fact ease of someone removing an obstacle from a child's path. "I've got it," I said. "I know you do." He kept walking toward the truck. "But you're paying me, so let me earn it." Danny grinned from the doorway. I almost smiled. The living room was next. My recliner sat in the corner where Megan had moved it, not where it belonged, not where it had lived for 15 years, but close enough to the window that the morning light still found it. Mike pointed at it and raised his eyebrows. "That one especially," I said. Danny patted the armrest as they carried it past me. "This thing is incredible," he said. "How old is it? 22 years. He whistled low. "Built different back then." "Yes," I said. "They were." Then came the cedar chest. It had sat at the foot of the bed in our bedroom since 1991, the year Mary found it at an estate sale in Bexley, and spent 3 weeks refinishing it herself, working on it in the garage in the evenings, after the kids were in bed, emerging with sawdust in her hair, and the particular satisfaction of someone who has made something beautiful from something neglected. She had polished it every spring with lemon oil. I could still smell the lemon oil if I put my hand on the lid and breathed. I walked into the bedroom when the movers reached it. Carl had his hands on one end, ready to lift. "1 second," I said. Carl stepped back. He did it without question, without impatience, the way a man does when he understands that some things require a moment. I put both hands on the lid of the cedar chest. The wood was smooth and cool beneath my palms, the way it had always been. The way it had been on the morning of Mary's funeral, when I had stood in this same room and pressed my hands against it for the same reason, because it was solid, because it was real, because some things stay exactly what they are, regardless of what is happening around them. Inside were the things that mattered to no one else. Birthday cards going back 30 years, a program from Megan's 5th grade spring concert. Jimmy's first report card, straight C's, with a note from his teacher that said he was a pleasure to have in class, even if his focus wandered. A recipe Mary had clipped from a magazine in 1987 for a lemon pound cake that she had made every Easter, and that I had never once told her was my favorite thing she made because I thought she knew, and later I understood that people need to be told. "Sir." Mike's voice came from the doorway, gentle. "Yeah." I took my hands off the lid and straightened up. My knees made their usual commentary. "Let's take it." They carried it out carefully. All 3 of them. Mike took one end, Carl took the other. Danny walked alongside with his hands hovering as if ready to catch something that wasn't going to fall. I followed them out to the truck and watched them load it. The morning sun was full up now, warm on the back of my neck. I stood on the front walk and looked at the house, at the brick front and the white trim and the Japanese maple I had planted as a 6-foot sapling that was now taller than the roofline. 22 years of growth. Some things you plant knowing you will not see them finished. My phone rang. "Patricia." I answered it, and sat down on the front porch steps, which were warm from the morning sun and slightly rough under my palms from 20 years of Ohio winters working on the mortar between the bricks. "The movers are here," I said. "Good." A pause. "Arthur, I need to tell you something I confirmed this morning." I had been waiting for more information since our meeting the day before. Patricia did not volunteer things until she had verified them completely, which meant when she said she had confirmed something, it was confirmed. "The lien on the property," she said. "I spoke with the lending company this morning. The loan was originated 8 months ago in November, the same month Mark registered the LLC, November. The same month he had filed Carroll Property Solutions. The same month he had started building the structure. The business address, the borrowed credibility of my home, the debt secured against my family's trust, piece by piece simultaneously, like a man laying multiple foundations at once. He planned this from the beginning." I said. "It was not a question." "The timing suggests a coordinated approach," Patricia said, which was attorney language for yes. I sat on the warm porch steps and looked at the yard, at the maple tree, at the fence line I had put in with my neighbor Ed Kowalski back in 2001, the summer before Ed's wife got sick and things got harder for him. Ed had moved to Arizona years ago. The fence was still there. "How much time do I have?" I asked. "The trust structure gives you significant protection," she said. "The lien may not be enforceable in the way Mark believes it is. I'm working on that. But Arthur," she paused, "there may be more. I want to keep looking." "Keep looking," I said. I hung up and sat for another minute on the steps. Danny came out of the house carrying 2 boxes stacked one on top of the other, navigating the steps around me with the easy agility of someone whose knees had not yet begun their long conversation with gravity. "You doing okay?" he asked, pausing beside me. I looked at the truck, nearly half full now with the accumulated evidence of my life in this house. Photographs and furniture and tools and the cedar chest and 30-some boxes of the ordinary things that turn out to be everything. "Getting there," I said. Danny nodded like that was the right answer and went down the walk to the truck. Carl came out behind him carrying my workbench top, the heavy oak slab I had bought at a lumber yard in 1999, and mounted myself, and I watched him carry it down the walk with the careful respect of someone who recognized that it had been made well. Mike appeared in the doorway. "We're about halfway through," he said. "You want to break for lunch?" I looked at the house, at the half-emptied rooms visible through the open front door, at the pale rectangles on the living room wall where the photographs had hung for 20 years. "Let's finish first," I said. The truck pulled away from Elmwood Drive at 3:47 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I looked at my watch when Mike shook my hand on the front walk and said they would have everything in the storage unit by 5. He had a firm handshake, the kind that means something from a man who uses his hands for a living. I thanked him. He said it was no problem, said it the way people say things they genuinely mean rather than things they are required to say. Then the truck rolled down the street and turned the corner and was gone. I stood on the front walk for a moment. The house behind me was not empty. The walls were still there, the floors, the fixtures, the kitchen cabinets Mary and I had picked out together in 2003 from a showroom on Bethel Road. The structure was intact. But the house had been relieved of everything that made it mine, and standing in front of it now felt the way standing in front of a face well feels after something fundamental has changed, familiar in outline, strange in substance. I locked the front door, put the key in my pocket, got in my car. Frank's house in Westerville was 40 minutes from Upper Arlington on a Saturday afternoon with light traffic. I drove it without the radio on. The silence felt appropriate, the way silence feels when you have just done something that cannot be undone, and you need the space to understand what that means. Frank had chili on the stove when I arrived. Ground beef kidney beans, the kind of chili that has been cooking long enough to mean it. He handed me a bowl without ceremony and pointed at the kitchen table, and I sat down, and he sat across from me, and neither of us said anything for the first 3 minutes, which was one of the things I had always valued about Frank DeLuca. He understood that some arrivals needed a moment before they needed words. At 5:47, my phone rang. Megan. I looked at the screen. Frank looked at me, looking at the screen. I turned it face down on the table. Frank reached for his cornbread. Somebody got home, he said. Apparently. The phone rang again. Megan. Then again. Then Mark. Then Megan. Then a number I didn't recognize that was probably someone calling from inside the house on a different device because the situation had become that urgent. The phone buzzed and rang and buzzed with the frantic energy of people who had walked into something they had not prepared for and were only now beginning to understand the dimensions of. Frank ate his chili. I tried to eat mine. The bowl smelled good, and the chili was exactly what chili should be, and I could not taste any of it, because my stomach had decided that now was not the time for appetite. You don't have to answer, Frank said. I know. But you're sitting there like a man who's trying to decide if he does. I put my spoon down. She's my daughter, Frank. She is. He tore a piece of cornbread. She's also a woman who called your doctor and told him you were losing your mind. Those two things are both true at the same time. I did not have an answer for that because it was accurate, and because accuracy doesn't always make things easier. By 6:15, the missed call count had reached 19. A voicemail notification appeared, then another. I waited until the screen had been still for a full minute before I picked up the phone and listened to the first one. Megan's voice. She sounded the way she had sounded at 16 when she had come home after curfew and found me sitting in the kitchen waiting that specific combination of fear and guilt and desperation to explain before she could be asked to explain. Dad, where is everything? Where are your things? Please call me back. I don't understand what's happening. Please. The second voicemail was Mark. His voice was different, controlled in the deliberate way that a person controls their voice when they are genuinely alarmed and do not want to sound genuinely alarmed. Arthur, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. Give me a call when you get this. We need to talk through whatever's going on. A pause, then, we can work this out. We can work this out. As if there had been a miscommunication. As if the issue was a scheduling conflict or a disagreement about a restaurant. As if 8 months of systematic planning could be characterized as something that could be worked out with a phone call on a Saturday evening. I deleted both voicemails. Frank was watching me with the particular steadiness he brought to situations that other people brought noise to. What did they say? Megan doesn't understand what happened. I set the phone down. Mark thinks there's been a misunderstanding. Frank absorbed that. Chewed his cornbread. A misunderstanding, he repeated flatly. That's the word he used. Frank looked at his bowl. Then he looked at me. Art. The man registered a business at your address, borrowed $180,000 against your house, and had his wife call your doctor to have you declared incompetent. And he's calling that a misunderstanding. He is. Frank picked up his spoon. Then he's either stupid or he thinks you are. By 7:30, the missed call count had reached 31. 31. I had lived in that house for 37 years, paid every bill that came through the mail slot, fixed everything that broke, replaced every appliance that gave out, and in 14 months I had somehow become a man that the people sleeping in my guest room felt entitled to call 31 times in 2 hours, because he had taken his belongings out of his own house. He's been on his phone in the driveway for the past hour. She came inside about 20 minutes ago. Looked like she'd been crying. Lights on in every room. Thought you should know. 3 dots appeared. Then, hard to say. She's alone in there now. He drove off about 10 minutes ago. I set the phone down on the table. Frank had read the exchange over my shoulder with the unashamed nosiness of a man who had been my friend long enough to have earned it. Mark left, I said. I saw. Megan's alone in the house. Frank was quiet for a moment. Outside his kitchen window, the Westerville evening was doing what Ohio summer evenings do, cooling slowly, the light going amber, and then rose, the kind of sky that looks like it's apologizing for the heat of the day. Art, he said carefully. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. He turned his spoon in his bowl. Your daughter. Do you think she knew all of it, I mean? The LLC, the loan, the doctor's office. Do you think she walked into all of that with her eyes open? The question landed the way Frank's questions usually landed, not gently, but accurately. I had been turning it over since the morning, since Patricia had said the timing suggested a coordinated approach, since I had sat on the porch steps and tried to reconcile the woman making phone calls about guardianship petitions with the 9-year-old who had brought me lemonade with too much sugar while Frank and I built the deck. I don't know, I said honestly. Frank nodded slowly, as if that was the answer he had expected, and also the one he found most troubling. Because there's a difference, he said, between a person who does wrong and a person who lets wrong happen. They both end up in the same place, but they're not the same. I looked at the chili I had barely touched, at Frank's kitchen with its worn linoleum, and the calendar on the wall from an auto parts store that had gone out of business 6 years ago, and that Frank kept up because he liked the picture of the '67 Mustang on the July page. No, I said. They're not the same. The phone stayed quiet for almost 20 minutes after that. Then it buzzed once more. One final voicemail. Megan again, and this time her voice had changed completely. The desperation was still there, but the guilt underneath it had risen to the surface in a way that the earlier message hadn't quite reached. Dad. A long breath. I need you to know that I didn't know about all of it. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know that. Another breath unsteady. But I need you to know. I listened to it twice. Then I put the phone in my shirt pocket and looked at Frank. She says she didn't know about all of it, I said. Frank met my eyes. Do you believe her? I thought about that yellow blouse, about the doctor's office, about the word all of it, which was a careful word, a word that acknowledged some things while leaving room around the edges. I don't know yet, I said, but I think that's the right question. The guest room in Frank's house smelled like cedar and old paperbacks, the particular combination of a room that is kept clean but not often used. There was a quilt on the bed that I recognized his late wife Gloria had made it sometime in the 90s, the kind of hand-stitched thing that takes months and means something. I lay on top of it with my shoes off and my hands folded on my chest, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me. Frank's house had its own language of nighttime sounds. The furnace ticking even in July because old houses run their systems regardless of season. A neighbor's dog making one disinterested complaint somewhere down the block. The refrigerator in the kitchen doing the same low hum that refrigerators have done since the invention of refrigerators, the most reliable sound in the American household. I was still awake at midnight. I got up quietly, the way you move in someone else's house when you don't want to announce yourself, and went down the hall to the kitchen in my socks. The overhead light felt too aggressive, so I turned on the one above the stove instead, the small one that threw a warm triangle of yellow across the counter. I filled a glass with water from the tap and stood there drinking it and looking out the window at the Westerville backyard, at the garden Frank had been meaning to replant for 3 years and hadn't gotten to yet, at the garage where his tools were organized in a way that made sense to him and nobody else. Figured you'd be up. Frank's voice came from the doorway. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and the kind of sweatpants that retired men wear with complete conviction, and he was carrying his own glass of water, which told me he had not been asleep either. He pulled out the chair across from mine and sat down. Set his glass on the table, looked at me with the unhurried attention of a man who had all night and knew it. "Talk," he said. "I don't know where to start. Start with Megan." He leaned back in his chair. "Not Mark, not the house, not the lawyers. Megan." So I did. I told him about the yellow blouse, about the way she had looked at me in the living room, and then looked away, and how that single moment had landed harder than anything Mark had said or done, because Mark was a man I had never fully trusted, and Megan was my daughter, the person I had run behind on a sidewalk with my hand on the back of her bicycle seat, sweating through my shirt and pretending not to be terrified she would fall. Frank listened. He was good at that, at the kind of listening that doesn't rush toward a response, that gives the words room to mean what they mean. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "About 3 weeks ago." He turned his water glass in his hands. "Mark stopped by here. You were at your follow-up appointment with Dr. Hassan, the one you mentioned in passing. He knew you'd be out." I looked at him. "Mark came here, rang the doorbell like it was nothing." Frank's jaw tightened slightly. "Said he was in the neighborhood. We talked in the driveway for maybe 15 minutes, seemed friendly, asked how I was doing, asked about my knee, asked about the car I've been restoring." He paused. "And then toward the end, he asked me something I thought was a little strange at the time." "What did he ask?" Frank looked at the table. "He asked if you'd ever mentioned updating your will. Said he'd been thinking about it because his own father had passed without one, and it had caused a lot of problems for the family. Made it sound casual, reasonable." Another pause. "Then he asked if I knew whether you'd ever given anyone power of attorney." The kitchen felt very still. Power of attorney. The legal document by which a person designates someone else to make financial and legal decisions on their behalf. The document that, in the wrong hands, would have given whoever held it access to Arthur Vance's bank accounts, his property, his financial life, everything Patricia's trust structure was designed to protect. "He asked you that," I said. "He did." Frank met my eyes. "And I told him I didn't know anything about your legal arrangements, which was mostly true." And he nodded and said thanks and drove away, and I thought about calling you, but I talked myself out of it, because I thought maybe I was reading too much into a conversation. He exhaled. "Art, I should have called you." "You didn't know." "I should have called anyway." His voice had the particular edge it got when he was angry at himself, which was a different quality than when he was angry at anyone else. Sharper, less patient. "A man shows up at your friend's house asking about your will while you're at the doctor. That's not a casual conversation." I thought about the timing. 3 weeks ago, which meant Mark had been working every angle simultaneously, the LLC already running the loan, already secured the real estate agent, already contacted, and now quietly canvassing the people close to Arthur to find out what legal protections might be in place. "He was looking for weaknesses," I said. Frank nodded once. That's how I read it now. We sat with that for a minute. The stove light made the kitchen feel smaller than it was contained, the kind of late-night intimacy that only happens in kitchens and only after midnight. She's still up. Light in the kitchen window. Just her, far as I can tell. He hasn't come back. I read it aloud to Frank. He listened, then looked at his water glass. "She's sitting alone in that house," I said. "Yeah, the house where she grew up." I turned the phone face down. "The house where her mother died." Frank didn't say anything. He knew the way he usually knew that this particular statement didn't need a response. It needed the space that came after it. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen window and then gone. The neighbor's dog made its one complaint again. The refrigerator hummed. "Frank," I said, "if she didn't know about all of it, the loan, the doctor, the full plan, what does that make her?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about things he considered worth thinking about. "It makes her somebody who looked away," he said, "when she should have looked at you." The words settled into the kitchen the way true things settle, without drama, without the need for elaboration. I picked up my water glass and finished what was in it and set it back down. "Yeah," I said. "That's not nothing," Frank said. "But it's also not the same as what he did." "No," I agreed. "It's not." The clock above Frank's stove read 12:47. We sat in the yellow stove light for a while longer. Two old men in a kitchen in Westerville, and eventually the talking gave way to the comfortable silence of people who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't require explanation. When I finally went back to the guest room, I did not lie awake staring at the ceiling. I pulled Gloria's quilt up over my shoulders even though it wasn't cold, because some things you do not for warmth, but for the weight of them, and I closed my eyes and I slept. My son Jimmy and I had not spoken in 2 months. Not because of a fight, not because of anything dramatic or final, just because life has a way of filling up the space between people who love each other but live far apart, and before you know it, the weeks have stacked themselves into months, and you are both still meaning to call and neither of you has. That particular failure is one of the quieter heartbreaks of getting older, the realization that good intentions are not the same as presence. Jimmy was 44 years old and lived in Denver, where he worked in logistics for a company that moved industrial equipment across the western United States. He had been there for 11 years since a job opportunity had pulled him out of Ohio, the way opportunities pull people out of Ohio, with the promise of more, and the unspoken understanding that more usually means farther away. He had his own apartment near Cheeseman Park. A truck he was proud of, a woman named Carol he had been seeing for 2 years and spoke about with the careful enthusiasm of someone who is trying not to jinx something good. He called on holidays. I called on his birthday. In between, we texted the way fathers and sons text, briefly, practically, with the occasional photograph of something one of us had seen that seemed worth sharing. It was not enough. We both knew it was not enough. We had never found the right moment to say so. I called him at 8:45 Sunday morning, sitting at Frank's kitchen table with my second cup of coffee. Frank had already been up for an hour and had gone out to his garage to work on the car restoration he'd been nursing along for 2 years, leaving me the kitchen and the quiet and the particular Sunday morning light that comes through east-facing windows and makes everything look like it might be all right. Jimmy picked up on the fourth ring, slightly breathless the way he sounded when he'd been doing something physical. "Dad. Hey. Everything okay?" "I need to tell you some things," I said. "It's going to take a few minutes. Can you sit down?" A pause. The sound of movement. "Yeah, I'm sitting. What's going on?" I told him. I started with the night Mark unplugged the television and worked backward through 14 months of small things, and then forward through the LLC and the real estate agent and Dr. Hassan and the guardianship petition and the hard money lender and the loan and Patricia's discovery about the trust structure. I told it the way I had told Frank, steadily, without editorializing, letting the facts make whatever case they were going to make. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "Dad." Jimmy's voice had changed. The slight breathlessness was gone. "Are you sure about all of this? The loan, the doctor? Are you sure?" I had expected the question. Not because Jimmy was doubting me specifically, but because the story laid out in sequence had the quality of things that seem too deliberate to be believed until you see the documentation. "I'm sure," I said. Patricia has the paperwork. I can have her send you what she sent me. Yeah. A pause. Yeah, do that. I forwarded Patricia's email while we were still on the phone. I heard Jimmy's notification sound on his end, then the particular silence of someone reading something on a screen that is changing the way they understand a situation. Jimmy, I said. I'm reading. Another silence. Then Dad. His voice had dropped a register. This is how long has this been going on? 8 months minimum, probably longer. And Megan? He stopped, started again. Where is Megan in all of this? That, I said, is the question I've been sitting with. He exhaled. Long and slow, the exhale of someone recalibrating. I'm booking a flight, he said. You don't have to do that. Dad. His voice had the particular firmness it got when he had made a decision and was not interested in talking himself out of it. I haven't been home in 8 months. I should have called more. I should have... He stopped. I'm booking a flight. I'll be there tonight. He landed at Port Columbus at 6:45 and drove a rental car directly to Frank's house in Westerville, arriving at 7:50 with a carry-on bag and the slightly stunned look of a man who has spent 4 hours on an airplane, absorbing information that kept expanding every time he thought he had reached the edges of it. Frank shook his hand at the door and said, "Good to see you, kid," which was what Frank had called Jimmy since Jimmy was 12 years old and was not going to change now. Jimmy smiled despite everything the way people smile at things that are familiar when everything else is unfamiliar. We sat on Frank's back porch because the evening had finally relented from the heat of the day, and the air was doing that thing Ohio air does in midsummer when the sun goes down, cooling fast, smelling like cut grass, and the particular green smell of a state that is mostly made of things that grow. Frank brought out 3 glasses of iced tea and then went inside with the discretion of a man who understood this particular conversation belonged to a father and his son. Jimmy sat across from me in the porch chair that Frank kept out there for exactly this kind of evening. He looked like me around the eyes always had, same set to the brow, same way of going still when he was thinking. He had more of Mary in his mouth, the particular way he held it when he was working something out. Tell me about Megan, he said. Not what she did. Tell me about her. The question surprised me. It was a better question than I had expected, and I told him so. I've been thinking on the plane, he said. There's 2 different stories here. There's the story about what Mark did, and there's the story about what Megan did, and I don't think they're the same story. No, I said. I don't think they are either. So I told him about Megan. The real version, not the version of the past 14 months, but the version of the past 38 years. The little girl who brought lemonade to the deck construction. The teenager who cried for 3 days when her cat died, and then turned right around and rescued another one from the shelter. The young woman who had driven Mary to every chemotherapy appointment that I couldn't make because of work, who had sat in that waiting room with a book she wasn't reading and a cup of coffee that went cold just to be there. She loved her mother, I said. I know she did. Jimmy looked out at Frank's untended garden. Dad, do you think Mark knew that? Do you think he used that? The thought had occurred to me. The idea that a man who wanted access to a house and its assets might look at a woman who was grieving her mother and see not a person but a leverage point, a way in a signature on a document, a name on a title. I think, I said carefully, that it's possible to be used without knowing you're being used. And I think it's also possible to let yourself be used because it's easier than asking questions you're afraid of the answers to. Jimmy nodded slowly. He turned his iced tea glass in his hands, the same way I turned things in my hands when I was thinking, which I had never noticed until right now. I should have been here more, he said. It was not a performance of guilt. It was just a fact stated plainly, the way Jimmy stated things when he meant them. After Mom died, I should have come back more. You had your life. You're my father. He said it simply. That's my life too. We sat with that for a while. The Ohio evening settled around us the way it does, gradually, generously, without rushing anything. Then Jimmy's phone buzzed on the armrest of his chair. He glanced at it. Something in his face shifted, not alarm exactly, but attention, the sharpening that happens when something unexpected arrives. He turned the screen toward me. A text from Meg and Jimmy. I need to talk to you. Not about Dad. About Mark. Something's wrong, and I don't know who else to call. I read it twice. Then I looked at my son. She reached out to you, I said. Yeah. He picked up the phone, read it again. Dad, I think she's starting to see it. Jimmy texted Megan back that night, and they agreed to meet the following morning. He didn't tell her he was in Columbus. He just said he was available and named a coffee shop on Fifth Avenue in Grandview Heights. The kind of place with exposed brick and local roasts and enough ambient noise that a difficult conversation could happen without the people at the next table knowing exactly what was being said. I didn't go. That was Jimmy's call, and it was the right one. Some conversations need to happen without the person they're about sitting in the room. I stayed at Frank's and drank coffee and watched Frank pretend to read the newspaper while actually watching me not eat my breakfast. Jimmy called me at 11:43. I picked up before the second ring. Dad. His voice had the quality it had gotten on the phone yesterday when he'd finished reading Patricia's documents that dropped register that new weight. Are you sitting down? Tell me. Megan showed up with a hotel receipt she found in Mark's car. Cincinnati. 3 weeks ago, a Friday night. She said she thought he was at a conference. A pause. She asked me to look at their joint bank account with her. She had the password. She said she couldn't open it alone. I waited. Dad Mark has been transferring money out of their joint account for 8 months. Regular transfers every 3 to 4 weeks, always different amounts, so it wouldn't trigger an automatic flag. Anywhere from $5,000 to $12,000 at a time. Another pause. All of it going to an account registered to a woman named Lauren Sims, Cincinnati address. The kitchen at Frank's house was very quiet. Outside the window, a cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, looked around with the alert intensity that cardinals have, and flew away. How much total? I asked. $67,000. Jimmy's voice was careful, the way voices get when they're delivering information that they know is going to land hard. Over 8 months. Dad, that's the same 8 months he's been living in your house. $67,000. The same period during which Mark Carroll had registered a business at my address, borrowed $180,000 against my family's trust. Instructed a real estate agent to price my house for sale and arranged for my daughter to call my doctor. He had been running every piece of this simultaneously with the focus of a man who had decided what he wanted and was methodically removing every obstacle between himself and getting it. And while he was doing all of that, he had been transferring $67,000 to a woman in Cincinnati. How is Megan? I asked. The question seemed to catch Jimmy slightly off guard, the way it had caught Frank off guard when I'd asked the same thing the night before. He stopped. Dad, she's not okay. She's sitting in that coffee shop right now, and she looks like someone pulled the floor out from under her. She found out about the loan this morning, too. I told her what Patricia told you. She didn't know. I believe her dad. She genuinely did not know about the $180,000. Did she know about Lauren Sims? No. His voice was firm. She found the hotel receipt 3 days ago, and she's been trying to convince herself there was an explanation. She hadn't told anyone. She called me because she didn't know who else to call. I looked at the cardinal's empty fence post. At the garden Frank kept meaning to replant. She called you, I said. She called me. A pause. She asked about you. Whether you were okay. Whether you were... He stopped again. She asked if you hated her. The word landed in my chest, the way certain words do not painfully exactly, but with a specific weight that stays. Hated. 38 years of a person's life, and that was the word she was sitting in a coffee shop in Grandview Heights, wondering about. I called Patricia, Jimmy continued. She wants screenshots of everything, the transfers, the amounts, the dates, the receiving account name. I took them while Megan and I were still at the table. Another pause. Patricia said the transfers are significant for multiple reasons. In Ohio, when a married couple divorces, the court divides marital assets equitably. But if one spouse can be shown to have wasted or deliberately depleted marital assets, her word was dissipated, the court takes that into account. $67,000 transferred to a third party over 8 months qualifies as dissipation under Ohio law. Dissipation. The legal term for a spouse systematically draining shared resources for purposes unrelated to the marriage. Mark had not simply been unfaithful. He had been funding that unfaithfulness with money that half belonged to Megan, which meant he had been taking from her twice, once with his absence and once with her own bank account. Patricia wants everything ready before Thursday, Jimmy said. She's confirmed the meeting, 6 people in her office. She said she wants Mark to walk in thinking he still has leverage. And does he think that? I asked. According to Megan, yes. Jimmy's voice had something in it now that I recognized, the particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of anger, but from anger that has been decided and set aside for a purpose. He came home last night, acted like nothing had happened, told Megan the whole situation with you was a misunderstanding that would sort itself out. A misunderstanding. The same word he had used in the voicemail. A man who had borrowed $180,000 against a trust he didn't own. Registered a business at an address that wasn't his, attempted to have the property's owner declared legally incompetent, and transferred $67,000 to a woman in Cincinnati. And his working theory was that the situation was a misunderstanding. Jimmy? I said. Yeah. Tell your sister I don't hate her. A silence. Longer than the others. When Jimmy spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that told me he had needed to collect himself before he could speak. Yeah, he said. I'll tell her. And tell her to call me when she's ready. Not before. When she's ready. Okay, Dad. After I hung up, I sat at Frank's kitchen table for a long time without moving. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. The cardinal did not come back to the fence post. Outside Westerville went about its Monday morning business. A lawnmower starting somewhere down the block. A delivery truck making its slow way down the street. The particular ordinary sounds of a neighborhood that did not know or care what was happening in any given kitchen on any given morning. Frank came in from the garage with grease on his hands and looked at my face and looked at the cold coffee and said, "Bad, complicated," I said. He went to the sink and washed his hands, dried them on the towel by the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. Complicated how? He asked. I told him about Lauren Sims, about the $67,000, about Megan sitting in a coffee shop in Grandview Heights asking her brother if her father hated her. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you tell Jimmy to tell her?" "That I don't." Frank picked up his coffee mug. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." The way Frank always said the things that mattered simply without decoration, as if the truth didn't need any help being true. Patricia scheduled the meeting for Thursday at 10 in the morning. 7 days after the night, Mark unplugged my television. 7 days can be a very long time when you are counting them. She called me Monday afternoon to confirm the details. 6 people in her conference room on the 14th floor, Arthur, Jimmy, Megan, Mark, as a material witness, and Patricia herself. She had prepared a document package that she described as comprehensive, which in Patricia's language meant it was going to be difficult for anyone in that room to argue with what was on the table. Mark retained an attorney by Tuesday morning, a man named Gerald Holt from a firm on Broad Street that specialized in civil litigation. Patricia knew the name. She said nothing about him except that she had dealt with his office before, which told me everything I needed to know about what she thought of him. Gerald Holt's office called Patricia's office Tuesday afternoon to request a postponement. 2 weeks, they said. Their client needed time to prepare. Patricia called me to relay the message. Her voice was the particular kind of even that meant she had already decided what she was going to say before she picked up the phone. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them my client has been more than patient," she said. Thursday at 10. I had not heard from Megan directly since the voicemail. Sunday night, the one where she said she hadn't known about all of it, where the word all hung in the air like something with edges. Jimmy told me she was staying in the house because she had nowhere else to go, and because Mark had come home Sunday night and Monday night, behaving with the deliberate normalcy of a man who believed the situation could still be managed if everyone just stayed calm. Tuesday evening, Jimmy came back to Frank's after spending the afternoon with Megan at a diner on Henderson Road. He said she looked exhausted. He said she had stopped defending Mark, which was different from the way she had been the day before, when she was still holding a small space open for explanations that were going to turn out not to exist. Wednesday came and went. I helped Frank in the garage in the morning, handing him tools and not talking much, which was the most useful thing I could do. In the afternoon, I sat on the back porch and read a book I had brought from the house. A history of the Ohio and Erie Canal that I had been meaning to finish for 3 years, and that seemed now like exactly the right thing to be reading. Something about people who had built things that lasted. At 7:43 Wednesday evening, my phone rang. Megan. I looked at the screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered. "Dad?" Her voice was different from the voicemails. Quieter. Less desperate, which paradoxically made it harder to hear. "Can I come over? Where are you?" "Parking lot of the Kroger on Dublin Granville." A pause. "I've been sitting here for about 20 minutes trying to decide if I should call." "Come over," I said. Frank was in the living room watching the news when I told him. He reached over and turned the television off without being asked, and said he was going to take a walk, which was Frank's way of giving people the kitchen, without making a production of giving people the kitchen. Megan arrived 15 minutes later. She knocked, which she had never done at my house in 38 years, and something about that knocked felt like information, like an acknowledgement that things had changed, and she knew it, and was not pretending otherwise. She looked tired in the specific way that people look tired when they have not been sleeping, because their mind will not stop working through something that does not have a clean resolution. Her hair was pulled back. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt I recognized from years ago, the Ohio State one she had bought her freshman year and never thrown away. She was not wearing the yellow blouse. She sat down across from me at Frank's kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the table in front of her, looked at them, then looked up at me. "I knew some things," she said. "I need to say that first. Before anything else. I knew some things and I looked the other way, and that's not the same as not knowing." Her voice was steady, but her jaw was working the way it had when she was a child, trying not to cry in front of people, that specific tightening along the jaw that I had seen 100 times over 38 years, and had never once been able to watch without it affecting me. I didn't know about the loan. I didn't know about Lauren. But I knew he was planning something, and I was scared, and I wanted it to work out, and I told myself it wasn't my business to ask. I looked at my daughter sitting across from me in Frank DeLuca's kitchen at 7:58 on a Wednesday evening. "The doctor," I said. "Dr. Hassan." She closed her eyes briefly. "He told me he needed documentation, that it was just a precaution." I told myself it wasn't going to go anywhere. She opened her eyes. "I told myself a lot of things." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight." Her voice broke slightly on the word "tonight" recovered. "I'm not asking you to forgive me at all. I just needed you to know that I know what I did, and that I'm sorry, and that I—" She stopped, started again. "I miss Mom. I miss her every day. And I think somewhere in all of this I was trying to hold on to something, and I grabbed the wrong thing, and I hurt you, and I can't—" She pressed her lips together hard. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She stared at my hand on hers for a moment. Then she turned her palm up and held on. We stayed like that for a while without speaking, which was not silence in the way that the silence of those months in the house had been silence, the silence of absence and avoidance. This was something else. The silence of two people who had said the necessary things and were letting them settle. Eventually she asked in a smaller voice, "What's going to happen tomorrow?" I thought about Patricia's document package, about the trust structure Mark did not fully understand, about $67,000 and a hard money lender, and a guardianship petition built on invented symptoms. About the 7 days since a Thursday night in July when a man had walked into my living room and unplugged my television and told me to go to bed. "The truth," I said. "That's what's going to happen. All of it in one room." Megan looked at the table. Then she nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing to something pleasant, but are agreeing to something necessary. "I'll be there," she said. "I know you will." Frank came back from his walk at 9:15, stomping his feet on the mat, more loudly than necessary, to announce himself, and found us still at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea that Megan had made at some point, without either of us quite noticing. He looked at the 2 cups and at the 2 of us, and said, "Anybody want cornbread?" And the tension in the room, which had been real and necessary, eased into something that was not quite normal, but was at least survivable. Before I reveal the full bitter confrontation that exposed the truth, please comment the number 16 or the words "still here" below, so I know you are still with me. Also, please note the upcoming events include some fictionalized elements structured for educational and entertainment purposes. If you feel this content doesn't align with your personal preferences, feel free to stop the video right here. I had been in Patricia Okafor's conference room on the 14th floor of the Huntington Center more times than I could count over the past 2 years, and I had never once looked out the window. That Thursday morning, I stood at the glass for a full minute before anyone arrived. Columbus spread below in the early light, the grid of streets, the Scioto River, the State House dome to the south. A city going about its business indifferent to what was happening on the 14th floor. Then the elevator opened. Jimmy came in behind her button-down shirt, 4 hours of sleep written across his face, and worn without complaint. He shook Patricia's hand, nodded at me, and took the chair to my left. Megan arrived at 9:58. She didn't look at me when she came in. She looked at the table at the window at her hands. But she sat on our side, mine and Jimmy's. That was not an accident, and I noted it without saying anything. Mark walked in at 10:03 with Gerald Holt, a compact, silver-haired man who set his briefcase on the table and clicked his pen twice with the air of someone beginning a performance he had rehearsed. Mark sat beside him and looked around the room with the steady confidence of a man who believed he already knew how this ended. When his eyes reached me, he gave one nod, the kind that means nothing. Patricia opened her folder. She began with the LLC. Carroll Property Solutions, registered in November, registered agent address listed as 4412 Elmwood Drive. Arthur Vance's home used without his knowledge or consent. Gerald Holt started to say something about informal family arrangements. Patricia set Ohio's registered agent statutes on the table without looking at him and kept going. She moved to the real estate inquiry. Sandra Cole Realty One Group contacted by someone representing himself as acting on behalf of the property owner. The owner had authorized no such contact. Gerald Holt wrote something on his legal pad. She moved to Dr. Hassan. A call to Arthur Vance's physician representing that he showed signs of cognitive decline. 11 years of records showed no such findings. Patricia placed Dr. Hassan's letter on the table. Gerald Holt picked it up, read it, set it down without comment. She moved to the guardianship matter. A consultation regarding Ohio Revised Code. Chapter 2111. The process for petitioning Franklin County Probate Court to have a person declared legally incompetent. No petition had been filed, but preparatory steps had been taken. Those steps were documented. Gerald Holt cleared his throat. These matters, while perhaps representing a breakdown in family. Gerald. Patricia's voice was pleasant and immovable. Let me finish. He stopped. She opened the second folder. The hard money lender. A lien filed against 4412 Elmwood Drive collateralized against Megan Carroll's beneficiary interest in the Arthur and Mary Vance Family Trust. $180,000, 14% annualized interest. Patricia explained without hurry that Megan's interest was a beneficiary interest within a revocable living trust, not a deed of conventional ownership. The property was held by the trust. Arthur Vance was its sole trustee. The lien's enforceability, she said, was a matter she was prepared to litigate at considerable length. Gerald Holt had stopped writing. Mark shifted in his chair. First time. Patricia opened the third folder and slid a document across the table. Bank statements. 8 months of transfers from the joint account of Megan and Mark Carroll to an account registered to Lauren Sims, Cincinnati, Ohio. $67,000. In Ohio, she noted the deliberate dissipation of marital assets is considered by the court in equitable distribution proceedings. The room went very quiet. Mark looked at the statements. Then he looked at Megan. Megan was looking at the table. Her jaw was set the way I had seen it the night before in Frank's kitchen, that specific tightening of someone holding something in by will alone. This is... Mark started. Mark. Gerald Holt's voice was low and urgent. Mark stopped. Gerald Holt looked at Patricia. Something had moved in his expression. The rehearsed confidence had shifted the way furniture shifts in a room when the floor settles. Could we take a short recess? Of course, Patricia said. They were gone 11 minutes. When Gerald Holt came back, he sat heavily and stated that his client would withdraw the LLC registration from Arthur's address, would not pursue the real estate matter further, and was prepared to discuss the lien in good faith. He said nothing about Lauren Sims. There was nothing useful to say. Mark stood. He looked around the table one final time at Patricia, at Dot, at Jimmy, at me. Then he looked at Megan. She looked back. Whatever passed between them in that moment was enough. He picked up his jacket, walked to the door, and went out. The door closed behind him. Nobody moved. The room absorbed what had just happened the way rooms do, quietly without ceremony. Then I heard Megan. Not loud, not performed. The real kind of crying, the kind that starts somewhere deep and comes up whether you intend it to or not. She pressed both hands over her face. Her shoulders moved. Jimmy put his hand on her back. I looked at my daughter. I thought about a 9-year-old carrying a pitcher of lemonade with too much sugar across a half-built deck on a summer afternoon in 1994. I thought about the yellow blouse, about the birds in the basement. Some things break. Some things can be rebuilt. You don't always know which is which until later. I put my hand on Megan's arm. She leaned into it the way she used to when she was small. I let her. I gave Megan 60 days. Not because I wanted her gone, because she needed time to find out who she was when no one was telling her. Mark left within a week. Businesslike. 3 days of boxes, no scenes, no words directed at me. Men like Mark Carroll don't rage when they lose. They recalculate. Whatever Gerald Holt was helping him plan next was no longer my concern. I came home on the 8th day. Frank drove me, pulled into the driveway, and sat looking at the house through the windshield for a moment before saying anything. "You good?" he asked. "Ask me in an hour," I said. He nodded. "I'll be at the shop." I went in alone. The house smelled like someone else's soap. A coffee mug I didn't recognize sat in the dish rack, but my photographs were back on the walls, every one of them at the exact heights they had always been. Mary's ceramic birds were back on the shelf. The recliner was by the window where it belonged. Megan had done all of it before I came home, without being asked. The 60 days moved the way time moves after something real has happened. Not fast, not slow, but differently weighted. Some mornings we had coffee together. Other mornings we passed in the hallway and said good morning and left it there. Both were enough. Day 31, she called to tell me she'd filed for divorce. Matter-of-fact brief. I told her I was glad. We moved on. Day 45, she found a one-bedroom in Grandview Heights, 12 minutes away. She sounded genuinely pleased the way people sound when something fits the life they're actually living. Day 60, a Saturday in late September, she hugged me on the front walk, both arms, chin on my shoulder. "Every Friday," she said. "Every Friday," I said. She got in the van. The Japanese maple was already turning red. I went inside and closed the door. The house was quiet, but it was mine. 3 months later, in the quiet chill of December, I was sitting in my recliner watching the Guardians season reruns, which, if you've followed this team as long as I have, is less a disappointment and more a personality trait when I started laughing at the remote control in my hand. Frank DeLuca had taped 2 words across the back of it 6 weeks ago. Arthur's remote. Black permanent marker applied with the gravity of a man notarizing an important document. I had called it ridiculous. I had not removed it. Every time I picked it up, I smiled, and I did not entirely understand why until tonight. It wasn't the joke. It was the fact that the joke had been necessary. That a 71-year-old man from Westerville had understood without being asked that some things need to be named before they can be kept. The room was right again. Chair by the window. Mary's photograph above the fireplace. Her ceramic birds on the shelf, cardinal closest to the light, the way she always arranged it. Megan had come last Friday. Apple pie from Mary's recipe eaten at the kitchen table with the game on low. We talked about small things. She hugged me at the door, both arms chin on my shoulder, 1 second longer than necessary. We did not mention Mark. We did not need to. Jimmy called Sunday. 40 minutes. Carol had apparently said something that made him reconsider the distance between Denver and Ohio. He was thinking. That was enough for now. Frank came Tuesday. Coffee. Chess. The silence of men who have nothing left to prove. I set the remote down and looked at Mary's photograph. "They lost again," I said. She was smiling, the way she always smiled, like she already knew the ending to every story I was still living through. Maybe she did. Just quiet. Just home. Looking back at my journey, I realize how close I came to letting others erase my life. I always thought staying silent was an act of love, but I was wrong. God gave us a home and a baseline of dignity to protect, not to hand over blindly out of guilt. This isn't just one of those old grandpa stories meant to pass the time. It is a raw family story about the steep cost of conflict avoidance. Don't be like me. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are under your own roof. My personal view is simple boundaries aren't selfish. They preserve the very structure of love. Every aging man has his own unique grandpa stories, but a true family story requires mutual respect, not quiet submission. We must stand firm before everything we built is packed away into the basement of regret. This definitive family story taught me that home is worth fighting for, and I hope these grandpa stories remind you to guard yours fiercely. What would you do if your own family turned on you? Share your thoughts, like and subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional, insightful narratives. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Kindly note, future episodes may contain dramatized elements structured purely for educational purposes. If this content does not align with your preferences, feel free to exit and choose another alternative.